All right, we're going to go ahead and kick things off for this week's WTF Wednesdays. And this wraps up this month's of Microsoft 365 discussions. This week we do have Seth Irby back. Welcome, Seth. Great to have you here. And today we're going to be talking about Microsoft Purview. And as always, so what we're going to do is we'll kick things off. Seth will start speaking, go through his presentation, and feel free to ask questions as we go. After his presentation is done, we will open it up to Q&A and open discussion. So ideally, if you could save the questions till right after he's done with his presentation, that would be great. And with that being said, I'm going to turn things over to Seth. I'll have him give a brief background about himself for those that are not familiar with him, and then he'll kick things off with this presentation. So, welcome, Seth.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, glad to be back. A couple weeks ago, for those that I do see some familiar faces, some that I've seen on the last couple sessions. But previously, what I did was I did a little bit of an expose, I guess, on Copilot. And one of the things when we were going over that is basically when we were talking about Copilot and security controls, one of the biggest gateways and controlling mechanism is that for Copilot security is all out of Purview. So when Dan and I were talking about future ideas, Purview just made the logical choice for me to come back and do a little bit of a session on to kind of get into more of a deeper dive of what that does and how that can be valuable to clients, MSPs, and everybody in between. Um, Again, I'm Seth Irby. My background and pretty much what I do is basically a standalone M365 security consultant. I do a lot of work in a lot of regulated industries, finance, healthcare, legal, basically anyone that has a pretty, high value or level of sophistication in their 365 environment, and just protecting, their overall identity security, data security, and a bit of like modern work transformation with Intune and mobile device management. So that's kind of my background at large and what I do, and we'll just go ahead and bust right into it. So, what is the function of Microsoft Purview? I'd like to think of it, it's really as kind of the watchguard of data transport in Microsoft, as well as, what's in REST. This gives us the ability, Purview is kind of the central control tower for anything in the Microsoft ecosystem. So you can kind of see here, this is a screenshot, or, basically a rip directly from the Microsoft documentation of Purview about what it does, right? So data security at large, being able to say, okay, where is this data at, doing data discovery, being able to create, different security controls about who has access to this data, not only in just the traditional, are you assigned to this group or not, but being able to do this at a granular level to say, okay, is this data labeled, or does this have a level of discretion that we need to apply just based on the content of the document itself? And that's going to that can travel with the document as well as it can travel to what the entitlements are based on users and what is set up in Purview. Data governance, that's going to be a big one too, that especially when we're talking about, these bottom two with data governance and risk compliance when it comes to Gen AI, right? Because that's going to be a big thing when it comes to what data that we have with Copilot. And one of the things for those that weren't available for the last session I did on Copilot, the thing that's unique or something to keep in mind with Copilot is that it presents data and only presents data the user is entitled to. So if you have entitlements based on user, if you're only doing entitlements based on identity access, saying, okay, you have access to everything in the site or you have nothing at all, then if that user has everything in that site context, Purview is going to bring that up, to the forefront of a user's interaction, regardless if they know that they had capabilities or not. So what Purview is going to do with that granularity is that's going to allow us to control data at that granular level. So we can say at a micro level of sophistication, okay, this document here or this repository here has a level of data security and sophistication that we have to protect, whether that's for compliance reasons, that's just for, general data security. I've actually seen some of this, this is taking off more so in CMMC and other regulated industries because, there may be certain secrets or levels of information that, A, they want to track, or B, they want to prevent people from having, privilege access to. So that's one of the main core concepts of what Purview does. And I think it's a bit cumbersome, quite frankly. I do think because this is such a sophisticated product with so many ins and outs and so many things, and if you never clicked into the Purview and you have the Purview portal and you have the ability to do so just to just take a look at it, highly advise it just to kind of step through it and get familiar with some of the functions and what it has, because there just may be something that this used to be what the Microsoft Compliance Center. It's gone through a couple different, recommendations and different name changes, but right now Purview is kind of what it's stood the test of time for the Microsoft ecosystem. Azure is also working on this. They have an Azure Purview and data connection modules that govern some of the Azure workloads, but Microsoft Purview at large, lots of different, lots of value propositions that come out of this. But there's also a lot of misconceptions. So I thought that was a great thing to just, jump into and discuss really where the value is for Purview and how to get started. So first things first, right? You need E5 licensing. Well, that's one of the biggest things that I get when we're talking about Purview is, where I'm doing some sort of consult or we're doing some sort of like solution engineering, and it's like, oh well, yeah, we can do this in Purview, or we can set these things up in Purview. And they're like, well, yeah, we don't have E5 licensing, or we have a cohort that has E5 licensing, but this is going to go a lot larger than that. And the short answer is you don't need E5 licensing, especially for MSP customers and our smaller organizations that are likely on under that 300 users on, that are capable for Business Premium. Business Premium includes a level of Purview, is kind of what they call like their core options. So sensitivity labels, data encryption, classifications. There are some basic controls that you can put in place with Purview, and that gets you really, really, really far, quite frankly. But it is going to take some intentional efforts to be able to design it that way. But the good news is you do not need the E5 licensing. You don't have to have full coverage of everybody in E5 to put them in Purview. You only need the users that are going to be, have data subject to it, as well as the administrators and other members of the organization that may need to have access to be able to review the data. Outside of just these core features, you can also, they have what they call the Purview Suite. This has been a remarkable value opportunity, quite frankly, for a lot of the customers that I've worked with, especially those, doing Copilot and, specific need cases. The Purview features can be purchased as like a standalone option that you can add on top of the business premium license for about $12 a user. Again, huge value add to be able to do this. And then what that extra Purview Suite license is going to do is going to give them capabilities to be able to do like content discovery and auto labeling and data, a lot of things that we can do within the data security posture management solution that isn't available with Business Premium. So lots of value to be had there. Another misconception again is that it only works with Microsoft files. And quite frankly, I think the value is that within 365 and the data ecosystems, you're largely probably working with Microsoft files by and large most of the time. So I think there is some value and there is some truth to it that it does integrate very well and it does have full support for any native Microsoft file, but PDFs, a lot of the Adobe documents, so Publisher, Photoshop, images, things like that, all that can be really protected in Purview as well. There are different levels, and I try to kind of create a quick glance chart here to be able to say, okay, what are some things that we can do? The case in point that I wanted to mention with like the labeling, the labeling is how we can kind of control our gateway and basically the routing and switching of where data is going in and where's data is going out with Purview. The reason I think that is valuable is because when we start building out some sort of like DLP controls, saying, okay, if this data is labeled sensitive, we don't want this, these users don't have access to email this externally, but these users would. So when we have these labels and these things created, we can use some sort of control policies that allow us to control to a really finite degree on where that data is actually interacting. Because if we have that locked down into a specific SharePoint folder, or we have it in a team site, but a user downloads that data, puts it in their Outlook mailbox, fires it off into an email, it's kind of lost the script. We have no idea where those copies are being stored. The features that we get with Purview and the data labeling allows those files to kind of transfer from piece to piece as long as they're going through the Microsoft ecosystem. So lots of value with the Microsoft products, but it's not largely uncertain, only limited to Microsoft products. There are some nuances, but there's still a lot of data protection we can do here. hopefully the little, table here, we can always kind of come back to it and speak. But there's a huge repository of all the information on the Microsoft website, the learn.microsoft.com, that shows what formats Purview natively controls this way. And kind of finally, and this should be no surprise to any of us here, right, is tools can only get you so far, right? And I think when it comes to Purview, and especially when it comes to just data security in general, as what I mentioned with Copilot, a couple weeks ago, the tools only get you so far in the sense that depending on the architecture and how data is structured, it just may not be conducive or may not be scalable, to a certain degree. So, sometimes I've seen this to where, the lift and shift, right? We take a large repository, a large file share that was traditionally on a Windows file server, and we created that root share that has everything in between it and moved it over to SharePoint. So when users want to go to, their files that are stored in SharePoint, we have a company, SharePoint directory with an HR folder, an accounting folder, and all these different nuances. And sometimes when we have, confidential data and what I would call like mixed use data, right? General, public information, general information that's public, and you don't really care if that gets exposed to internal assets. And then you have highly confidential and private data to where, this has maybe PII or other identifying information in it, or just some general things that maybe contain board notes, strategies, other business documents that, we really don't want to share with anybody outside of the organization, and maybe even very limited people like our executive or senior leadership team. So when we have that type of data intermingled with a lot of other general and public data, when we turn Purview and we start trying to monitor that data in a huge, uh, mixed use environment, the tools can get a little chatty. And that's something that I've ran across when we were doing some, Purview implementations and tuning, is we have data that is just so intermingled that it's so hard for the ecosystem as well as the people that are managing that data to really keep up with it. So that's just something to keep in mind, is when we're doing something. And yeah, Purview is a great tool and has a lot of capabilities. Um, Depending on the architecture, we could be creating more problems than we're really solving by putting this tool in place, especially when it comes to the workload to our staff and whomever is helping us, manage this asset. Cover that a little bit more too, because as we get into data security, there's a little bit of, I think of foundational and framework type stuff that has to really encompass a true data security framework to really mitigate the issues that we have with mixed use environments. So again, never seen the Purview portal. This is kind of what it looks like at large. If we go into kind of the solutions, so purview.microsoft.com, you go into the solutions, you can see here it's tons and tons of data. Lots of different things that we can do. The big thing that I think is really important, at least you should be familiar with, is the audit. The audit is basically, if you've never used this, the audit is going to track all the activity that is going on with 365. So, help desk gets a call and say, hey, we used to have this file on SharePoint. Now it's gone. I don't know what happened to it. Can you recover it? You're able to restore the previous version. Hey, I want to know who moved that file. Well, you can find that information within the audit category. So it has a lot of value as just a general tool that's really in the Purview portal. But really the audit isn't like in a traditional sense what you would think of as far as the traditional compliance. It's very much a valuable tool for sysadmins and other engineers. Information protection, that's going to be DLP, that's going to be the labeling, the sensitivity types, how you want to handle discovering content. Very, very helpful, very rich. That one is going to be a kind of a mile long, inch deep kind of category there, because there's going to have so many different encompassing levels of how data can be protected in 365. And then e-discovery, that's a big one. If you've ever gone through the case of having to do an e-discovery episode, maybe for a client that's being sued or data is being requested, that's typically within the e-discovery platform. And so it just seems scarier because, it's typically a very pointed action. But e-discovery also has the ability to look up information between two parties. I've gone through this before when there's been, internal investigation cases where, an employee has maybe said something to another employee over Teams or, a direct email or whatever the case may be, especially when it comes to Teams and, things that aren't traditionally found within Exchange. E-discovery allows us to pull all that information from, different parties and everything else. So I'm sure that that's something that, you know, maybe you have familiar with or you've been asked before about, oh, can we actually see the data? How do we actually see the data if somebody's sending messages maliciously or uh, with hostility to another team member internally? We can pull all that data out of e-discovery. So moving along, why this matters, I think this is because the 365 ecosystem, for better or for worse, allows a lot of flexibility and a lot of dominion and how they manage, groups, which wasn't traditionally found a lot in, traditional file shares, or maybe you just didn't make it as easy. By default, users can create the M365 groups. So you may have this with certain clients where they've had Teams accounts or they had Teams groups that users have generated. So you have an HR group that maybe you created that has its own SharePoint site, and then somebody internally has also created an HR chat that maybe is a separate group that has its own accompanying data to it that we have no idea what that type of what data is being shared in there. This gives us the ability with Purview to say, okay, we know the zones that we've created, but how do we get visibility and how do we make governance around things that we don't know? And a lot of that can be done based on types of the information as well as creating certain groups and categories of what type of individuals would maybe have access to sensitive information. Kind of the next piece on this is Gen AI, right? So Copilot, the Claude, all these other different Gen AI solutions, this gives us the ability to just be able to get information, at kind of a breakneck speed. And I think one of the things that when we're talking about Copilot, and this is what I wanted to kind of allude to, is the ability to control and get visibility of what's going on with Copilot, how people are using it, not only a sense of just usage of like, hey, are people actually putting queries into this thing, but we can also create purview governance around that to say, okay, are people using this in an unethical way? Are they trying to, what they call, I believe they use the term jailbreaking, right? They're trying to jailbreak the prompt lockdowns and guardrails to be able to get it to, expose information. You can also do this within the DSPM to say, what data is being shared in Microsoft Copilot, how many people are sharing, information that we've classified as sensitive. So if a user, again, that entitlement's based on Copilot, if a user's entitled to sensitive information, there's no, stopping them from being able to share that information into Copilot unless we put some sort of DLP policy in that and in Copilot and Purview to say, okay, yeah, sensitive data does not, cannot be added or interacted with Copilot. You can only have data that is labeled of this type. And then we can pit those controls to be able to make sure that people are following suit. So how to get started? Best thing I'd say is jump right in. Go purview.microsoft.com, click around there, get a kind of an understanding of what's happening, within, what information's where. The docs and the knowledge base that are included is basically just kind of a reskin or rebrand, a lot of linking to the very public learn.microsoft.com. That's a huge, value resource. And then there's also some training that Microsoft has in some of their learn categories. One of the ones that I really thought was very valuable and kind of a great way to get your feet wet is this what they call the Purview Ninja training. What this is basically do is a lab. It's actually a Microsoft orchestrated lab where you actually step through Purview using sensitivity labels, and you're able to kind of create some of those 101 level governance policies. So very valuable to try and just get your feet wet and understanding, the look and feel of Purview as well as how do you pull off some of the basic security and governance frameworks. And probably the last thing that I want to share is maybe a bit of a hot take, but I don't believe Purview is inherently valuable for MSPs. I believe it's more valuable for clients. And I think the reason I want to call this out is because the value and the structure and the success of Purview is around data strategy. So if you have clients in protected industries, right, in finance, healthcare, legal, government contracting, things like that. They all have a need, rather they realize it or not, to have better control and structure around their data. What I think this sometimes gets into a bit of a fit for MSPs is, quite frankly, we don't understand the client's data. We don't have an idea of, should this user have this level of access, or should this user be interacting with this data this way? Because, we're custodians. We don't own that data. We have no idea what it's being used for. So a lot of times, we do need a partner. We need to have an advocate internally to help us understand, what this data is. And so when we start building these governance structures, I think a lot of times, and I've had these conversations as a consultant, and I'm working a lot with internal IT teams that may be working with technology partners today. One of the first things I tell them is, if we turn this on, we build these things out, you're going to have, some level of staff that are going to be devoted to basically tickets. They're going to be devoting to those compliance alerts to be able to review those files, and they're going to have to figure out, and again, same thing, the internal IT is going to face the same trouble. They're not going to understand the data. So when these things turn on, there's going to be multiple stakeholders, multiple accountability partners that need to understand that they all have a responsibility into this data security. So when we turn these things on to protect the data, we're also going to have allies and people that can help us understand, okay, is this data actually belong to this type of person? Is this an expected job function that they should be doing? So forth and so on. So just want to kind of highlight that here, especially within what I mentioned to you earlier about the framework about data owner, controller, and custodian. I think when we start talking about the needs for the client, and protecting that data, is brokering conversations around that as well, because that's going to help both teams, both the internal client need as well as the MSP team be more successful if they can understand that, hey, this is a tool, and then in IT and security are going to have dominion over it. But at the end of the day, this is going to go so much larger than the traditional IT footprint, that we're going to have allies and counterparts in other areas of the organization that can help us understand this data, so we can tune it and make the appropriate actions. And that would be it for me. So I appreciate taking the time. I guess we can go ahead and open it up to questions, and looking forward to talking about it a little bit more.
Awesome. Great work on that. And let's go ahead and open it up to questions. Who wants to jump in first? Don't make me have to do the whole lottery system, I mean, because everybody's just jumping towards the mic.
Well, one thing that I was going to ask, but I kind of poked around and found out on my own is can we get to it from the partner center? Because I don't see Purview listed as a service manager, but apparently clicking on Microsoft 365 compliance brings you there.
Yeah.
So
Odd
naming.
that they don't call it Purview. I don't know.
It used to be the compliance. I think I, try to highlight that for and as we all know, right, they've rebranded to Intra ID for probably 4 years, but you can still
Mhm.
find Azure AD even in the admin centers and stuff. And so
Yeah.
yeah, there's always the naming bugs. But yeah, that would make sense that they would call it the compliance center, because that technically was its old name before they rebranded to Purview maybe 2 or 3 years ago now.
Perfect. Other questions? I guess one thing I'd like to ask you is, what is something that an MSP could in the next month, maybe next 2 weeks, or even the next week, implement in Purview that you probably think is not in place today?
Yeah, certainly. I think one of the things that I always recommend, especially when we're talking about, so first things first is licensing's got to be a core concept, right? And one of the ways that you can do this is you can add the Purview suite on top of, and this may be familiar with some of those that are used to conditional access and the other policies. The licensing is kind of a pay to win type functionality, where you have to, that the functionality doesn't unlock until you actually have the appropriate licensing, added to the tenant. So, if you have customers, you have clients that you're interested in and thinking this could solve some problems. And they have business premium today, which is going to include most of the core concepts. Uh, Kind of that first start, really, I think to play around with is sensitivity labels. And you can get as complicated as you think it sees fit, or you can be as simple as basic as, hey, this is general and hey, this is private. That's actually what I have for my own controls. For my stuff is I only have the two labels. I have general information and private. So if I create a document that doesn't have any business operations things or any proprietary information, by default, it labels it private. If I have, or in general, if I have data that I'm working with, I'm creating an Excel spreadsheet for pricing calculators or forecast models or anything in the biz ops or, underwriting guides for insurance or something, I go ahead and label those as private. So if I'm using my Copilot license, I'm sharing any data with a client, maybe I accidentally get a little heavy-handed and share a parent folder of data that is valuable to a client, and I want to share it with them. But this specific document that I have in there, I don't want them to have access to. That sensitivity label is going to give me that kind of granular control, and that, like I said, that's a pretty easy one to get set up today. And that Ninja training kind of takes you, kind of a lab version of how to implement it.
Yeah, I think the your last slide you brought up a great point as far as how this is more for the client than for the MSP. And with that being said, I mean, I think when it comes to those labels, that's where those conversations with the client, beyond just the decision maker, beyond just the liaison, is so critical, and having a discussion with all end users and learning, what those labels are, right? Because, I mean, those are things that we just aren't going to have the level of intimacy without conversation.
Yeah, and I'll share this, just as a consultant that's working with a lot of different parties on these things. My let's call it like my ramp up to starting a Purview conversation and data security takes about 90 days. Because when I first broker the conversation, I'm like, okay, all cards on the table. You need to know what data you have. You need to understand how you want to structure this. There's a lot of discovery and due diligence that has to be done with this. And typically what happens is, they realize like, okay, we want to take this seriously. We need to understand what we have going on. We need to make, conscious efforts all from the client side to be able to understand what this is going to undertake. And so they end up doing a lot of homework and we keep in touch with it. But a lot of times we're not actually exercising the first steps of this would-be engagement until probably anywhere from 45 to 60 plus days out because the client is, real once I lay it all out for them, they realize all the work that has to be done to it. And so they're, cleaning it up, they're doing their own homework, they're reorganizing SharePoint sites, they're doing a lot of, pre-work in order to make this project more successful because of that nature, right? Is that there's a lot of work that has to be done in understanding the data and creating a business decision on how you want that data to work because that's exactly what happens. We put this tool in place and we say if this is private data and this has confidential information or wherever it is, there's no splitting hairs. Once that document is labeled as such and we create these policies, you have to have everything's got to be followed to the letter and unless you're going in there and constantly tuning those alerts and quite frankly the platform is not extremely fast and responsive, not as a limitation of the product itself, but because it's data, searching through data, archiving data, indexing data. It's like, just traditionally with any type of index and databases, you change, a portion of that data, the database has to recalculate everything entirely. And, that index is going to take some time to rebuild. That's basically what Purview is doing. As soon as we make these changes, it's going to take up to 24 hours for this stuff to propagate and be able to, really, proliferate around the environment. So that's why I always say it's very much with Purview and these types of engagements. It's a very much a measure twice, cut once type, exercise because you want to be as thorough as possible to prevent always having to go back to the drawing board and make these changes.
What's a realistic starting point? You mentioned like in your organization, you have those two labels, which I think keeps it real simple. But as you progress beyond that, what are those starting points of working with a new client, from a labeling perspective, so it doesn't become overwhelming?
I think the first starting point isn't a client, it's the MSP. I mean, how many of us here are on M365 already? How many of
Right.
us are already using data where how many of us are already doing a lot of cloud work, with SharePoint and that type of stuff. So I think the first, real venture here is writing your own ship, right? Is figuring out the data from the MSP. What are our knowledge base articles? What are these, simple general public type things that we can, really just um knock out as far as sensitivity labels, and then where is this sensitive client information, where are some things here that we can really protect. So my first trial run, I think it would be great for MSPs to work on implementing this for themselves. And then, as you get a better understanding, you learn how to manage it. You can take that same functionality and showcase it to your clients. You can, it already will hopefully pay off internally, especially like, for those types of environments where, maybe there's confidential information, especially for small teams where you can't be as judicious in saying, okay, we're running a 4 or 5 man band. You only have access to this. You only have access to this. You may need to have that type of flexibility. So one of the ways that gives you that flexibility is start putting controls on what happens to the data, not just who has access to it. And then once you get that understanding, I think you're a lot more equipped to be able to have a conversation with a client and let them know, like, this is the trials and tribulations of doing this type of exercise. This is what I need from you. This is what I believe this could help, solve problems you have today.
So as you're putting this in place for yourself, it's a great opportunity then, to build out that framework, build out the documentation, so that, as you do go to your first client, you have all that, that whole process in place so that it's not okay, where do we begin, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and again, you're going to understand. You're going to be armed to the teeth because you're going to have the admin capabilities to do it. You're going to have everything you need from the admin portal to make adjustments, do all the audits, things that you need to do, and likely you're going to understand that data. Oh, I know this folder has XYZ information. I know this folder doesn't. So when you're building all these things out, you're already going to be playing with, kind of the cheat codes in it because you're going to understand what's going on, within the environment. When you get to a client, even if it's a client that you work for many years, maybe you have, a high level degree of knowledge of, okay, this is where finance keeps, their information, but you're not going to know all the ins and outs of how detailed that information goes like you would need from the client, as an advocate. So again, yeah, you get it right for yourself. You understand your data, you put it in place. You're gonna be able to focus a lot more on the platform and the controls versus, and quite frankly, you kind of want to mess up on your tenant. You want to mess up on your controls and
Yeah.
experience, kind of eat your own dog food a little bit before you do that. Because
Yep.
quite frankly, that's how it happens is, you put these controls in place, black and white, and you're like, oh, well, I did that. Now my users can't, teams each other these files anymore because I marked them confidential. I need to go on Purview and make the proper exclusions and access permissions. You want to be able to figure that type of stuff out on your environment where you kind of have all the control and know all the ins and outs before you kind of put this in production for a customer.
Before I jump into my next question, actually, there is a question. I was going to ask if anybody has any additional questions before I throw another
Jackie.
question out there, but Jackie's wondering, are there any resources for list data types that is cross-referenced to industry? So
Yep.
basic, out of the box rules for blocking emailing of credit card info and so on.
Yeah, let me see if I can be crafty enough to drop the link while I talk about it. In Purview, those are called SITs, sensitive information types, and I think there's like over 100 different sensitive information types already classified in Purview. So that's everything from as we know as in the Western Hemisphere as PCI data, social security numbers. checking routing numbers as well as Swift bank codes. What else? Driver's license numbers for, Australia. Like there's a lot of sensitive information types at large that are already created. And then in the information protection, you can find that information there about what they are. And like I said, they're very, very comprehensive. And they have different levels of how they determine that. They typically have like a confidence level, because it's, sometimes it's scanning, doing a little bit of machine learning, sometimes it's just regular number matching, things like that. So those are really already coded and work well. And then what they do is, and I think I found my full list here. I'll just drop that. But they have like what they call a confidence level of saying, okay, we found this to be a social security number, or this looks like a social security number, but we're a confidence level of, call it 50. And you go into the file and you may actually just find serial numbers or GUIDs or something that kind of have that dot dash, kind of social security pattern, and that's what they're picking up on. But at least with the sits, you can, tune them to pretty standard and pretty wide-reaching levels of data types.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes it less daunting. I mean, when you think about thousands and thousands of files that are out there and just the whole process of doing this, in addition to that, can you elaborate a little bit more about auto labeling and the benefits of that, how that changes the conversations with end users?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a that the auto labeling I think is a great double-edged sword because it gives
Okay.
you the ability to discover data that you probably wouldn't know, or to have this information, but you have to, the ceiling can be blown off the roof, because what happens is that if the auto labeling, or depending on whatever the data types, again going that mixed use data, if you have sensitive information, because and that's something I always recommend when doing these sets and you're doing the auto labeling policies, is changing that confidence level. That's one of the first things I do. I forget what the default is, by default, with what their actual matching pattern is. But one of the things I try to do is, at least in that, at the top level, is just give it like a very high level of confidence. So start doing a high confidence level set of social security numbers, right? And putting that on top of a file, and then or on a SharePoint site or structure, that's going to give you the ability to say, okay, yeah, these are likely to contain social security numbers, and it's going to be something like maybe employee onboarding info or something like that, and you can make the appropriate controls in place. And one of the things that I'll say kind of at a high level is, um, Purview may give you the visibility and the things you need to be able to take action on it, but Purview may not be the answer. One of the things that I recommend, at times, and I've had to do this before, where we have a treasure trove of data, right? Like we go in here, we have this public share, we're in the finance folder, and then we're in this reports folder, and in the subject of reports, we have all our, PCI information, or customer account number information that has, that's very privileged. One of the things that I've had to do and recommended is say, okay, look, this data is very much a hot zone. Everything else is kind of, relevant, or in a gray area as far as what is truly sensitive, because it is relevant to the finance department. Let's actually move this out into its own SharePoint resource or to its own site. That way we can completely lock it down, and we know, if we have a finance department of, 14 people, but only 3 people in the whole organization need to have access to this specific amount of data, let's actually go ahead and pull that out and put that data elsewhere, because it doesn't really change. It doesn't have to change a whole lot for the user, but that allows us to put site level permissions and controls on the data overall, versus that type of mixed use data, and relying on number matching and pattern discovery. So that's kind of what I would say at large, is doing the auto labeling and doing that kind of content discovery. There's actually a module in Purview that allows you to do content discovery, and it will actually show you what information is likely to be found. And some of that is going to be a mixed confidence level. So kind of take it with a grain of salt. But it gives you the ability to kind of drill down into the data and say, okay, yeah, I had no idea we were storing copies of all our employees' driver's license in this folder. Let's rip that out and put it in an onboarding SharePoint site so we can really lock that down and make sure nobody has access or that data doesn't leave, our organization.
All right, I want to open up to any additional questions out there before I jump in with some more that I have.
I got one.
Yeah,
Is
go
there,
for it.
can you, so with so many people working from home now after COVID and whatnot, can you make like a SharePoint, have them log in if they're using a home computer, they can log into their 365 account, get at the SharePoint files and whatnot, but prevent them from being able to download them locally and make copies of stuff on their home computer?
Yes, so there's a couple ways we can do this. So the first thing you can do is actually within SharePoint, you can actually control that to basically say how do you want to interact with data. Finishing this thought, so you can actually go into SharePoint and say, okay, from unmanaged devices, what do you want? How do you want data to be interacted with? So basically, say if a device is unrecognized, it's not hybrid joined, it's not registered to Entra ID. Microsoft has no idea what type of device it is. You aren't able to download. You can only view that type of data, or add stuff to the folder. Um, that's something you can basically do within SharePoint natively without actually doing something within Purview. On top of that, depending on how homogeneous I would call it, your 365 environment is, one of the major projects that I work on a lot is doing hybrid joining and conditional access type work with a lot of my clients because that allows us to also use device status as kind of a DLP metric, right? If that, in your case in point, we need users to have access to this data or to the site because they're onboarding or whatever the case may be, but we don't want them to be able to have access to it, from their home machine, or we only want to provide limited access. Entra ID, conditional access, SharePoint, all that stuff allows us to do that natively. And then we can kind of just build on top of that or in auxiliary to with some of the controls we get in Purview. But that type of functionality is built into core core SharePoint controls by
Hmm.
default.
All right. You're
Dan, you're
muted, Dan.
muted, I believe.
Still muted.
There we go. Other questions? Thank you, Jay.
Jay, send me an email. I'll point you on that.
What's your email address?
So I can drop it in the chat.
All right, cool.
That's easier.
So, when we take a look at Purview, obviously the first thought is always uh, clients that are under some type of regulatory compliance, but I think the benefits are really for any client. I mean, the risk of accidentally emailing out a document that is contains sensitive information, whether it be internal organizational information, client information. I mean, the risks are real. And do you find that Purview is overlooked when it comes to that, where it's, hey, let's only go through this process because because we have to for regulatory compliance?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it's a mix of both. I think one of the things too is for the longest time, when we talked about DLP and file controls and all these things that, you can get out of Purview, when you're talking traditional on-prem Microsoft infrastructure, there's nothing that's ever equated to this type of control and access anywhere on-prem ever without some sort of third-party product. So I think for a lot of traditional, smaller businesses that are maybe, that have only migrated to Microsoft, maybe during the COVID era, they're just quite frankly unfamiliar with this type of functionality being present at all without really paying for another product. And I think, like I said, if they're using Business Premium today, which gives a lot of value for, our clients under 300 users, they have the capabilities to use a lot of, or, Purview can benefit them already today. So I think it's a little bit of just them not being aware of what's out there, and this is being available to them. And then just a little bit of unfamiliar territory because again, there's been no equivalent of this product in the Microsoft ecosystem ever before. It has a lot of functionality. One of the things that I've done for clients, even just kind of ancillary, we're doing some sort of engagement and we're talking about Purview as maybe a next step is, hey, we can build a DLP, we can build a couple DLP policies in audit mode, and I can have it just start sending you emails when a social security number is detected or PHI is detected, and you can kind of see how big does this problem really go. So that's what I mean about some of the lead times that these things give, is because when we start turning the taps on and we start getting the filters and they start getting an idea, it's helping the clients gain visibility into the data. Because it's like if you've ever set it up a sim or anything for these clients, or for yourself, there's just so many things in the audit realm that we just we don't have the time for, if we just don't have the ability to be truly proactive. And Purview gives that ability to be able to be truly proactive with your data. And that's the value of it, but it's also the blessing and the curse, because you have to keep an ear to the ground and watch what's going on, and know where that data is going. And, should this type of, is this normal activity where we're emailing customers this information, or is it not? I think yeah, there's a lot of stuff. And the other thing they're working on this, and some of those that have read some like the Verizon data breach reports, and probably a lot of things coming in other security areas, is insider risk, right? That's kind of been the buzzword for the last, couple years now. Is not only are we worried about, the external threat actors, but, you know, how much damage could a rogue employee do, right? You've got a rogue sales rep that has a lot of account information, and he wants to take all this information to a competitor who's going to pay him, 100 grand more a year to come work for them. So can he just, email himself all the confidential account information, wait for his NDA to expire, and then go after all the clients? That's the same thing that could happen to an MSP.
Mhm.
So I think this is the thing, is being somewhat blissfully unaware of what features and problems could be solved with Purview if you take the time to learn how to manage the platform.
On that topic of insider risk and, I mean, insider risk management, what's the best approach of discussing this with clients without them thinking that you're paranoid? Obviously, it is our job to be, somewhat paranoid from that perspective because, let's face it, if there's an opportunity for somebody to do something, it will happen. And
Yeah.
so what are some of those conversations that you would recommend with clients?
I think one of the things that I found is a big ally to this, not only for advocating for some sort of insider risk management, but a cyber insurance, is, there's sometimes underwritings and writers to understand, again, um, ransomware was the big heyday, and then we started working with our clients on, getting cyber insurance to prepare for ransomware. Now, probably a lot of us have seen, 2, 3, 4 page questionnaires about, what all information, what all controls are put in place to mitigate ransomware. That's
Yeah.
just, part of the times and stuff after this has happened. My, my bet book is going to be, we're now going to see information coming through in cyber insurance carriers probably over the next 12 to 18 months about what are you doing for insider threat? What is the proliferation of MFA deployed inside the network? How are you validating users or who they say they're using, and doing, the activity you want them to do? I think a lot of these conversations are going to be, brokered by cyber insurance going into the future. And then I think either getting ahead of that and talking to the clients of saying, hey, this is something that is breaking a lot of news in industry. People are talking about, overexposure of information. And then, it's one thing that inevitably an account can be broken. But what happens when, you have a user you didn't think was a risk had way more information access than you ever thought they did because nobody was there to check in, user access rights and, what type of file data that is. And then the other piece too is just not only getting access to email accounts, but what is actually living inside people's inboxes, right? Retention policies, the legal risk that comes with that, and things, all that information is able to be brokered out of Purview. So I think the impetus, maybe cyber insurance. I think if, you're having true CTO, CIO level conversations with your clients, it'd be facilitating that access on your own of, hey, I think we've done a great job at locking you down and securing outside the walls, but what is your understanding of risk of rogue employees? What if your lead sales rep, your lead business, development try to take all your client data somewhere else? Would you know about it? How would you know about it? Can you do anything about it? What stops them? And I think, Purview and the tools that we can put in place into 365 can really help mitigate that for, small clients because and just like ransomware, they go after everyone now. It's not even the big targets.
Other questions out there? So when we take a look at leveraging cyber insurance, I mean, I think it's a great way for us to be able to take the heat off of us. That this is, well more than just what we're recommending, that there are real business reasons that this needs to be put in place. Obviously, this becomes a project. This is not part of the, day-to-day management of, what their MSP agreement is. So, we do that project work, we get everything set up. And then I do believe that from that point forward, assisting them with, any kind of needs as far as changing labels or just assisting them is just part of our day to day. But with that being said, once things are set up, what kind of, when all that heavy lifting is done, what kind of ongoing needs do you typically find, whether it be through a technology business review or maybe, they bring it to our attention? Because we obviously want them to keep this top of mind, not, hey, let's do this once and then they forget about it.
It's an add-on package, quite frankly. I've had a lot of conversations because of the nature of the business, right? Freelance, 365 consultant. I do a lot of work with other MSPs and other, mutual, customers and stuff of clients. And, one of the things that I've recommended and stuff, that I do is kind of bringing this on as an add-on service because, yeah, it is going to take some quote unquote project hours to stand up and get it right, but it's going to be one of these things to where you can't just really set it and forget it
Yeah.
and really do the client or you any good. I think the way that I've seen it and I've been trying to help some of my, partners and friends in the industry figuring out a model of bringing this to our clients and saying, okay, yeah, we want to implement Purview or you guys need to implement Purview. You've got and especially now, like I had a conversation with an MSP a few months ago where they were trying to work with a big online retailer, let's call it that. And
Mhm.
in order for them to do the work for this big online retailer, they had to have very tight financial and audit capabilities to understand who's interacting with their data. I was like, yeah, let's rip it up in Purview and we can create all that audit retention so we can know over a year's time who's been interacting with that data. And so one of the things that's coming up is a lot of our clients are needing these types of capabilities to do big business. So I think the way that I position it to my partners and people that I work with is you add it on as an add-on model. Say, hey, we can either build this out for you as a project and set this up, and this is what the fee is, or you can pay us $800 more a month or whatever the math you would need to work out and say, okay, we're going to actually manage, data security as a service for you. And we're going to, implement Purview. We're going to create the tuning request. I'm going to have a dedicated engineer or I'm going to have an engineer that is going to be savvy and trained into this. And I can compensate him or her effectively because it is going to be a skill set that isn't as traditional to the help desk side. Therefore, it's a different cost accounting. That's one of the things that I've worked with a lot of MSPs, big and small, and trying to figure out packaging this as a different offering because it is so different from the traditional, MSP, service and support. So hopefully that kind of answers the questions. I don't think
Yeah.
we can just do a project. I think this is going to have to be a ongoing service, and you can probably demonstrate the value of that rather quickly with a client once they realize, the amount of work and the type of information that, we're going to be exposed to from these types of events.
Yeah, and I think even if you don't itemize the cost, if you add it as a item to your invoice, they see that, and then they see, oh, ultimately I'm paying for management of this, and then I think it becomes a little more real of, I mean, because we all look at what we spend and we look at, okay, what are we doing with this? What are we doing with this? And if something's on there, they're going to want to make sure that they're getting, the most out of their money for that. So I just threw in addition to Seth throwing his email into chat, I did throw in a link to his LinkedIn. Seth is available, for consulting. So if you are in need of hiring Seth, feel free to reach out to him. He's available to assist with projects that you're having that you're working on that might be outside of your normal wheelhouse. So, with that being said, Seth, any one parting word for our audience?
One parting word, no, but I do think in your next conversations, as you're prepping for your QBRs, your ABRs, however whatever cadence you're doing it, um, I encourage you to bring this up as a conversation about just data security in general. Get a gauge for your clients to understand potentially how, are they aware of it? Are they aware of this type of risk to the organization and how much, are they really losing sleep at night over it? Because I think this is going to give you, a better idea of the value this brings not only for your MSP and what you're providing for our clients, but it's going to give you some a leg up and visibility into what's going on through clients' minds, especially now that the traditional footprint has been mitigating external threats and mitigating these external risks. Now we broke our conversation. Okay, what happens when somebody's in the four walls? What do we do? Somebody's on the VPN and has access to a trusted network. How do we protect that data? And I think you'd be surprised if you just let them know, not to even scare them, but the slightest amount of, what these risks are, like sales reps and people leaving information and taking it elsewhere or selling it wholesale. If you're interested and you want some case studies, I can absolutely email you some where, there was a hospital in New York that was, I think they had 40,000 patient records that were sold because a patient care manager was selling PHI on the dark web.
Mhm.
And it was a multi-million dollar episode because it went over for 2 years where this person was
Wow.
just having unfettered access. So, I mean, there are very major case studies where somebody, the monster was inside the house, right? And
Right.
that's
Yeah.
something I think we owe it to our clients to let them know they are these risks, rather small, but
Yeah.
a risk is still a risk.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, as much as we want to have faith in, the people that work for, our organizations, our client organizations, there are villains out there. There are bad
Mhm.
actors,
Mhm.
and we have to protect our clients. So, all right, Seth, thank you so much for your time today as well. Everybody, thank you for being here. Hope you enjoyed today's session. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you guys later. Take care,
So
everybody.
long, boys.
Sounds
Thank you.
good. See you.